Autumn has always been a special time in a small town. People were preparing for Halloween in advance. Every house was decorated with cobwebs and pumpkins. Children ran around the streets in costumes, and adults organized parties and contests. In this city, Halloween was almost the main event of the year, and every resident tried to participate, as if this was their secret pride. The hero of this story was a young man named Zach. He was 22, and over the past few years he had found a hobby in conducting quests and scary pranks for his friends and neighbors. Every year he planned a new game, thinking through every element of it to impress everyone. Zach was famous for the fact that his every quest was not only scary, but also unbearably realistic, and every year his participants left the party with tension and adrenaline. This year was no exception. Zach decided that his last idea was to create a quest that everyone who decides to participate will remember. He sent out invitations to friends, describing in detail that this time the quest will be different from the previous ones and will require courage and endurance from the participants. Zach created a whole concept. The quest was called The Silence of the City. The participants had to go around several themed locations throughout the city, from an old motel to a small abandoned warehouse, where terrible surprises await them. This time, Zach wanted not only his friends to take part in the game, but also several local guys who would not normally be among his acquaintances. It was said that such tournaments are organized according to special rules, and in order to gain access to the game, you need to know passwords or find special signs indicating caches where clues are hidden. Zach was well aware that the project needed to be approached with extreme care. He checked every detail, inspected the selected locations, and even spent several days learning how to enhance the effects of fear. According to the idea of the quest, the participants had to go through the locations alone, without the right to outside help. At each stage, a new fear awaited them, which had to be overcome. Zach called it a fortitude test, but friends joked that he just wanted to see which one of them would shout first. This Halloween, however, the city was gripped by some tension. A few weeks ago, reports of strange cases appeared in the news. 2 young people disappeared after a walk in the evening. A suitcase with personal belongings was found abandoned by someone in the forest, and suspicious lights were seen near the lake for several days in a row. No one knew what was going on, but residents tried not to focus on it, and the city administration convinced everyone that there was no reason to worry. Nevertheless, these events did not pass by the plans of the law. He immediately realized that he could use the atmosphere of mystery surrounding the disappearances to create an even more frightening quest. He made contact with the owner of the motel, who agreed to open an old abandoned wing of the building, long closed to visitors, where, according to rumors, several unexplained incidents once occurred. The motel was located on the outskirts of the city, next to the forest, and was known for its frightening corridors and rooms, each of which contained elements from past eras. Zakovo's quest plan became even more daring. He set up locations so that the path passed through the most sinister and deserted parts of the city. The first place is a dilapidated barn on the outskirts. This place has long caused unpleasant feelings among the locals, but no one knew the exact history of its creation. Zach had prepared traps and hints there that would lead the players to the next point. Each place was full of carefully selected details. For example, in one of the rooms of the old motel, he placed a mirror with the inscription "Daredevil will find a way out" and artificial bloodstains on the floor. Halloween night finally arrived. Everyone who was invited to the game gathered, and they discussed the terms of participation with interest. Zach, wearing a mask and a dark suit, gave out instructions, and then lit candles in each of the rooms he had prepared, enhancing the atmosphere. He reminded the participants of the main rule. It is impossible to leave the territory of the quest. The game will start exactly at midnight, and anyone who for some reason decides to leave the game earlier will have to reach a special gathering point near the forest border. Linda was the first to approach the location. She was one of Zach's best friends, but this time she was overcome by a strange feeling of fear. Zach told her to go to the old barn, where a note was waiting for her, which indicated the further route. It was dusk in the barn. Small dust particles hung from the ceiling from the wind, and everything reminded of old abandoned buildings. Linda stepped forward, feeling the cold creep under her clothes, and saw the first task. She had to open an iron box with a key, which, according to Zach, was on the other side of the world, or rather, in an old motel. Linda moved through the dark corridors of the motel, her skin crawling with every sound. Finally, she reached the room where the key was supposed to be. As soon as she entered, the door slammed shut behind her and the lights went out. Linda's pulse sped up, but she knew it was part of the game. A dim light flashed ahead. It was a small lamp on the floor, illuminating a small piece of paper on which was written, "You see what you want to see. Just don't open the door until you hear footsteps." The next was Nick, who always tried to appear brave, but deep down he was afraid of such quests. He was directed to the basement, and as he moved there, he clutched his phone in his hands, the light of which was the only source of illumination. Suddenly, he saw an image of a human palm painted with fresh paint on the wall. There was another note on the floor: "You've reached the final. Open the drawer and read what's hidden inside." When he opened the drawer, he found a photo of Linda inside. From the very room she had entered a minute ago, Nick stared intently at the photograph. It showed Linda standing in the middle of that motel room, facing the door, but her face was tense, as if she had noticed something disturbing. Nick was trying to figure out where this photo could have come from when he heard a strange sound coming from behind the closed basement door. At first it seemed to him like muffled breathing, then there was a crackling sound, as if someone was scratching the door from the other side. Realizing that something had gone wrong, Nick tried to remember if Zach had mentioned anything like that in his instructions. "It's just a prank," Nick told himself, hoping that Zach was just trying to amplify the effects of fear. But when the sound of scratching got closer and the door began to slowly open, Nick panicked and tried to get out through the other side of the basement, but he lit up only one corner. There was no way out. All he could do was hide behind an old closet and hope that he wouldn't be noticed. At the same time, Linda realized that something was wrong with the quest when she discovered that the door in her room was locked, and attempts to open it did not give any result. She exhaled, hoping that this was just part of the game, but after spending 15 minutes waiting, she began to panic. She had the feeling that someone was watching her. When she sat down with her head in her hands, she noticed another note under the bed. "You will lose if you leave this room." Not knowing what to do next, Linda was startled by an unexpected sound. In the far corner of the room, a faint light appeared from somewhere in the wall, like a beam from a flashlight. She started walking towards him, but as she got closer, she felt something cold on her neck. It was air from a crack in the wall. Her palms were sweating, but she tried to reach for the light source when she heard a barely audible whisper, "You know you shouldn't be here." Nick and Linda realized that they could not leave their locations. They started randomly hitting the walls and calling for help, but no one seemed to hear them. Zach, meanwhile, stood outside and watched the rest of the participants, who also began to suspect something was wrong. They were trying to figure out where Nick and Linda had gone, because according to the plan they were supposed to meet in a few minutes at a common gathering point. But time passed and no one appeared. Zach, hearing from someone that screams were coming from the motel, hurried to the building. As soon as he opened the front door, he found that the lobby was immersed in an unusual semi-darkness, and no lights were working. He went to the basement, where he thought Nick might be, and noticed on the floor the same photos that Nick had found earlier. Only now there were other participants in the game, filmed in the last moments before disappearing. Zach walked out of the basement into the cold night air, looking around, hoping that this was someone's prank, but he had the feeling that someone was following him. Zach could feel cold sweat forming on his forehead as he walked out of the basement and looked around again. The atmosphere around him was frightening. The dark streets unlit by a single lamp, the sounds of the night seemed excessively loud, as if they were being listened to not only by him, but also by someone else. Thoughts were spinning in my head that the quest had not gone according to plan, and what he and his friends were arranging had crossed the line beyond which there was no return. He returned to the motel, where panic began among the remaining participants. Some had already started shouting, calling for people, but Zach knew that it was all part of the game. He wanted everything to be really scary, but not so that people would disappear. He couldn't figure out what was going on. He searched the rooms and corridors, but found no traces that would explain the disappearance of Nick and Linda. On a shelf in one of the corridors, he noticed a black bag that had not been there before. It stood slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten it. Zach went over and opened it. Inside there were a couple of photos showing people dressed in costumes who were definitely not participants in his game. These faces are not familiar, but the expressions on them, the look on the pictures was the same: confusion and fear. Zach felt his heart begin to beat faster. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered to himself as footsteps sounded in the hallway. He looked up, expecting to see one of his friends, but a stranger was standing in front of him. A man in his 40s, with a pale face and dressed in a dark coat that was completely out of place. He stood motionless, just looking at Zach. The man's gaze was cold and calculating. Zach couldn't figure out how he got here, but feeling something alarming, he took a step back, but his movement stopped. "You still don't understand what you started?" The stranger's voice was low but strong, as if the man knew what was going to happen to them next. Zach couldn't answer, and then the stranger turned around and disappeared around the corner. Zach didn't know what to do. Fear held him down, but he needed to find his friends and bring them back, even though he was already beginning to suspect that this had all gone too far. He ran to the basement, but when he opened the doors, he found himself in some place that he did not remember. There was no staircase, and instead there was an old spiral staircase creaking under his feet. Everything was dark around, but when Zach came down, he saw that the walls of the hall were covered not just with dirt, but with some strange liquid that looked like blood. There were objects on the floor that were familiar to him. Old suits, fragments of clothes. All this created a strange feeling as if other people had once been here. Maybe they were looking for a way out, but they didn't find it. Zach started to turn around in panic, hearing strange sounds in the distance. He noticed that someone was moving in the shadows ahead, but they weren't his friends. Zach tried to approach, but his footsteps echoed on the walls, and suddenly all the lights in the room went out. He cried out in surprise, but there was no response to his cry. With each passing moment, it became more and more obvious to him that something was wrong here. He didn't have time or opportunity to think when he heard the noise behind him again. He turned around and for a moment met the eyes of the man in the black coat who had disappeared around the corner. The man did not move. His face remained invisible in the darkness, but there was such fury in his eyes that Zach could not understand whether it was true or fear that made his imagination draw these scenes. When Zach tried to move again, he was stopped by a note that was tied to the wall at eye level. He took it off, and on a piece of paper it was written, "You realized too late where you were going." These words made his heart freeze. Zach was sure it was part of the game, but the tension in the air left no room for doubt. Something didn't add up here. In a panic, he ran again, hoping to find a way out, but the faster he moved, the more he felt like he was being chased. And although this fear was not new to him, he now felt not just anxiety, but real danger. Zach turned around and, taking a deep breath, rushed to the next staircase, which led to the exit to the street. He had almost reached the door, but at that moment he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Zach opens the door and sees Linda. She looked as if she had just returned from some scary place. Her eyes were clouded, and there were indistinct marks on her hands. Linda stood silently, as if nothing had happened, but her gaze was frightening. At that moment, Zach realized that someone was manipulating their game. Someone who knew more than they did. Zach continued to wander through the dark corridors of the motel, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't figure out what was going on. Everything looked as if someone had decided to bring horror to his own quest. But one thought nagged at me. It was all too real, too terrible to be just part of the game. As he moved on, his gaze fell back on those photos. Each of them was now distorted, as if they depicted not just moments, but desperate faces of people who already realized that the game was out of control. Zach held up one of the photos, which showed Linda with her eyes full of fear. It wasn't just a photo. It was a recording of the moment of her disappearance. At some point, a figure appeared around the corner. Zack felt something cold creep up his neck. He froze, realizing that this was not one of the participants in the quest. It was someone else, someone who shouldn't be here. The footsteps became louder, and now, a man in a dark suit appeared in front of him, whose face was hidden by a mask, but his eyes sparkled with a bright, ominous light. He was standing right in front of Zack, and in his hands was the same knife that Zack had used in previous quests to create fear effects. "You still don't understand," the man said, and his voice sounded like an echo, as if he had said it more than once. "You thought it was just a game. And now you realize that this is not a quest, but a trap." Zack stepped back, but it was too late. He felt the cold of the metal as the knife stabbed into his stomach. A sharp pain shot through his body, and he fell to the floor of the motel, not believing what was happening. And then, with every passing moment, the picture became clearer. Whoever was standing in front of him was not just a part of the game. It was someone who had been watching him for a long time, who had long known about his passion for quests, and who realized that his passion for intimidation could be used in real life. Zack struggled to his feet, and his eyes filled with a panicked realization. His whole game was rigged against him. It wasn't an accident. Everything was planned. He became part of his own game, but not on the terms he expected. His gaze swept over the motel, and he realized that at the moment when he conceived the quest, he had already played someone else's game, a game where he was not the leader, but the victim. When Zack lost consciousness, the only thing he managed to see was a figure disappearing into the darkness, and the very knife he had once used lying next to him on the floor.